Hi everyone, welcome to the session. In this session, we will continue our discussion on the determination of Fed fund rate, and we have covered the discussion on deriving the demand curve for reserves, and in this section we will focus on the supply of reserve in the Fed fund market and as well as the determination of Fed fund rate in the Fed fund market. So, coming to the supply part, supply in the market for reserves, you please recall I have mentioned in the one of the previous session, that means supply in the market for reserve is coming directly from the Federal Reserve System. There are two components into it, one is non-borrowed reserve and the other one is borrowed reserves. And about the non-borrowed reserve part, that is coming through open market operation, that is through the purchase and sale of government securities by the Federal Reserve System from the banking system, that is open market operation. And the second one is through the discount window, that using discount rate, changes in discount rate, the central bank lend to the member banks. So, that is called borrowed reserve. So, we have also said that actually the cost of borrowing from the Fed is the discount rate. So, we have made that there are two components, the total reserve that the central bank is injecting in the economy through the banking system can be classified into two types. One is non-borrowed reserve, because this reserve is coming to the member banks not by borrowing from the Federal Reserve System but by selling their government securities, whatever the government securities that they are holding, they are selling some part of it to the Federal Reserve System. So, in that way the reserve is coming to the member banks, and this reserve is called as non-borrowed reserve. And second component is borrowed reserve. This actually depends on the willingness of the member banks to borrow from the central bank. So, by making the change in the discount rate, that the rate at which central bank lend to the member banks, by making a change in the discount rate, that is incentivizing them. For example, reducing the discount rate, obviously you know that the cost of borrowing from the Fed declines and the member banks will be more incentivized to prompted to borrow from the central bank and utilize this fund for lending and buying government securities. So, this part we are going to say that this is borrowed reserve. So, in this diagram, let us start with first how central bank is supplying reserve in the Fed fund market. Then as a result, first draw the supply curve and then let us see what is going to happen when they are making further changes in open market operation. Then what is going to happen to the supply curve. And here we begin with the Federal Reserve System is engaging in open market operation, and suppose they are doing this is the open market operation, that means they are injecting for example here that this much money, this much let us call for example 100 billion. So, this is coming completely through the banking system by open market operation, that means the open market purchase by the central bank. So, as a result when they are buying 1 billion, 100 billion of government securities from the member banks, then you know that that much reserve is supplied into the market, into the banking system. Then as a result the reserve of entire banking system increases, the liquidity of entire banking system increases as a result, right. So, in this case suppose we are not talking about the other window, that is the borrowed reserve window, the discount rate, that we will discuss immediately after completing this discussion. Suppose here in this discussion here the reserve coming to the Fed fund market in the banking system is going to be 100 billion, and we are going to call it NBR, that is through the open market purchase. What if they increase? Suppose instead of open market operation they purchase some more government securities, suppose they make into 150. So, you can see that then the reserve increases further, right. The reserve that is the NBR increases further, this is become NBR, let us call it NBR2, this is the first one, NBR1, then this will become NBR2, that means the as a result of open market operation, you can see that the reserve in the banking system increases. So now suppose they want to reduce the suppose they reduce the open market operation, the purchase of government securities, then you know that it will be declining to this much. For example, then you can say this is NBR 3. So that means open market, instead of open market purchase, if they do open market sale, then they will be reducing the reserve with the banking system. So in this case, let us see now how the rate of interest will be determined. Suppose the initial open market operation they conducted, and as a result assume that they injected $100 billion into the banking system. So you can see that this is the demand curve. Demand curve you already derived. The supply curve is vertical. Supply curve is vertical because this is inelastic to Fed fund rate. It does not change. The supply of the reserve in the Fed fund market is an arbitrary decision. It is taken by the Federal Open Market Committee. They do not take into account the market Fed fund rate, right? So this is interest Fed fund rate inelastic, and this is a vertical line. Because this is an arbitrary decision, they do not take the Fed fund rate as it is not responsive to Fed fund rate, right? It is a policy decision. So from this we are going to call that this curve as the supply curve. This is supply of reserve. This one is demand for reserve, and this curve is the supply curve. So this is the, suppose if you are doing only open market operation, if you are considering only open market operation, let us take some more time before introducing the other window, the discount window. Then we can see that suppose there is only open market operation, then the intersection, the supply curve intersect the demand curve at this point. So at this point you can see that this is the intersection point, and accordingly you can see that this is the Fed fund rate determination. So the Fed fund rate, the RS, the supply curve of reserve, and the demand for reserve curve intersect at this point, and this is going to be the Fed fund rate equilibrium Fed fund rate, and this is the quantity supply, that this much is the RS and is equal to RD. So given this open market operation, then you can see that the Fed fund rate will be determined at this point. Now what we can see that, what if they increase the open market purchase, that means open market purchase by the Federal Reserve System, and they inject more reserve into the banking system, then this is going to be the new equilibrium point, and the Fed fund rate decreases to this point. This is going to be a new Fed fund rate, right? Similarly, what if instead of open market purchase, what if they do open market sale and take back the reserve from the banking system? Then you can say that in this case the Fed fund rate is going to increase. Fed fund rate is going to increase to FFR2. This is all what we have discussed now, only the open market operation, that is the non-borrowed reserve component. And we have also seen that discussed in one of the session that the Federal Reserve System has more control over the open market operation, that is the NBR, than the borrowed reserve. Borrowed reserve, we have seen that depends on the banking system's willingness to borrow. Let us now talk about the second tool, that is the borrowed reserve, that is through the discount window. The discount rate is the interest rate charged to commercial banks and other depository institutions on loans they receive from their regional Federal Reserve Banks lending facility, that is through the discount window, right? The discount rate and the Fed fund rates are both used by banks to maintain reserve requirements. So the difference is that banks use the discount rate when borrowing from the Fed, and the federal fund rate when borrowing from other banks. So this comes as the tool, that means the central bank is the lender of the last resort. So whenever commercial banks need money, they can approach the central bank for their fund. But what central bank can do, the Federal Reserve System can do, they can, by changing the discount rate, by increasing the discount rate, for example, they can discourage the borrowing by the member banks, and if they want to lend more through the discount window, they can reduce the interest rate at the discount rate, then they will be incentivized to borrow more. So all discount window loans are fully secured with collateral. So the Federal Reserve banks offer 3 discount window program to the depository institutions. One is called primary credit, second one secondary credit, and seasonal credit, with which each with its own interest rate. For example, coming to the primary credit rate, it is the basic interest rate charged to most banks, is slightly higher than the Fed fund rate. And the current discount rate, if you visit Federal Reserve System website, you can see that that is going to be 2.5%. So the discount rate that we are going to discuss in this session is this primary credit rate. Then there is secondary credit rate, that is a higher rate that is charged to banks that don't meet requirements needed to achieve the primary rate. It is 3%. It's typically a half a point higher than the primary credit rate. In addition, there is seasonal discount rate, that is for small community banks that need a temporary boost in funds to meet local borrowing needs. That may include loans for borrowers, students, resorts, and other seasonal activities. Now let us bring the supply of reserve through the discount window, that is through the borrowed reserve window. Let us bring that one in our diagram. So before that, I am also showing this. I have taken on this date the current primary credit rate, the secondary credit rate, seasonal rate, and the Fed fund target rate. So importantly, you can see one, that means the Fed fund target rate, this one, that the 2.5, the upper limit, you can see that the primary credit rate is equal to, at this point you can see that this is going to be, this is same, that the discount rate and the upper limit of Fed fund target rate is same, that is 2.5%. So that what we are going to do, that we are going to see how the upper limit in the Fed fund target rate can be achieved by changing the discount rate. That is what we are, that also we are going to discuss. Actually we are going to discuss 2 points. One, the discount rate, using the discount rate, how they are able to decide the upper range of the Fed fund rate, and similarly about discussing the interest rate on reserve, how they are able to define the lower limit of the Fed fund rate. This is the supply curve. When we are, suppose the vertical part, we said that this is the non-borrowed component, that is the supply of reserve constituted mainly by non-borrowed reserve. This much supply is decided by the NBR component of the reserve. And after that, suppose there is a demand for the quantity supply, then after that whatever they do through the discount window, by determining the discount rate, suppose they determine the discount rate, for example here let us call it ID, for example let us make it, for example 2.5%. This component, if there is demand, suppose right now the demand curve, the equilibrium is already achieved at this point, this is the supply curve's vertical component is intersecting at this point, then what we can do, that we are going to gradually shift the demand curve rightwards, then to see how discount rate is going to play a role. But at this moment here we can see that this is the supply curve's vertical part, that the supply of reserve. So that means this much part we are going to say this quantity, that means suppose we say that this one is 100 billion. So this much is NBR component of the supply of reserve, and this part is going to be the borrowed reserve. borrowed reserve component. So when we talk about the supply component, the quantity, this much part is the NBR component, and this part is going to be the borrowed reserve component. But when the suppose to the open market purchase, suppose the curve is shifting rightwards, that means the non-borrowed reserve curve, the NBR component of the supply of reserve shifting rightwards, then obviously you know that the NBR component is increasing like that, and the borrowed reserves component will be declining. So what is special with this ID? So in the previous session we have seen that the federal fund rate will never go below the interest rate on reserve that we have seen 2.25%. It will never go. Actual Fed fund rate will never go below 2.25%, because we discussed that, we found there that it is better for the banks to deposit their money, to deposit in the federal reserve system, and earn interest instead of lending to the Fed fund market at a rate less than the IR. And another thing we are going to see that the Fed fund rate is never going to be above the interest rate on discount rate, the interest rate on Federal Reserve System's loan. So the Fed fund rate is never going to be above the discount rate. Why? The reason here is that suppose the FFR is due to some reason, let us see that FFR is going to be, for example, 2.6%, and anyway the central bank is going to give loan at 2 point, that the ID is 2.5%, and I am going to say that FFR is never going to be above the interest rate on the discount rate, because what if it is going to be 2.6%, if the federal fund rate, due to some reason, if the markets for Fed fund rate, the discount rate, the Fed fund rate is going to be 2.6%, then it is better for all the member banks to borrow from the Federal Reserve System and lend in the Fed fund market. That means they can borrow from the Federal Reserve System at a rate of 2.5, and they can lend in the Fed fund market at a 2.6%. Then the difference that this the difference here is that 0.1%, that is going to be their profit. But you know that in that way they can lend, but there is no one is going to borrow at a 2.6%, because anyway the they can borrow at a 2.5% from the Federal Reserve System. So because of this intuition, this reason, we can confidently say that federal fund rate is never going to be above the discount rate. So that means the upper rate of Fed fund rate is going to be the discount rate. So two things we inferred here. The lower limit of Fed fund rate is it can go minimum this much only, that is 2.25%. It will never become 2.24 or 2.22 like that. That is the lower limit, and upper limit it can become maximum equal to the interest, that the discount rate, it will never go above 2.5%. Accordingly, this is the reason. So when the Fed announced the lower limit and upper limit, actually they are also changing the reserve, the interest rate on reserve. This they are deciding, this also they are deciding, then only they can attain. That means they can make the member banks to fall in the boundary, that the lower limit and upper limit, and the effective Fed fund rate will be somewhere between the lower limit and the upper limit. So in this example, this is going to be the Fed fund rate. Suppose let us see that this is, for example, 2.4%. Now let us see what if Federal Reserve System is going to reduce the interest rate. So here the ID one is this one. Suppose they are going to reduce the discount rate to 2.45%. So that means then the upper limit is going to be maximum 2.45%. It will never go, the Fed fund rate will never go above 2.45 percentage. The reason that we discussed just now, that means the actual Fed fund rate is above 2.5 percentage. It is profitable for all banks to borrow from Federal Reserve System and lend in the Fed fund market. But you know that no one will be borrowing there, because why should they borrow it above for 2.45 percentage from the Fed fund market, since they can easily get funds at a 2.45 percentage, that is the discount rate from the central bank, from the Fed Reserve System. So what we can see that by reducing the discount rate, they can actually limit, also reduce the upper bound of the Fed fund rate. So when they reduce the rate of interest, is going to the curve, supply curve is going to shift like that. So this is RS1, this is then RS2. This is going to be like this. So what the simple explanation I have given here, borrowing from the Fed is a substitute for borrowing from other banks. If interest rate on Fed fund rate is less than the discount rate, then banks will not borrow from the Fed. Banks will not borrow from the Fed, and the borrowed reserve are going to be zero. So you can see that in this case the determined federal rate of interest is 2.4, and when Fed fund rate is 2.5, that the discount rate is 2.5, you can see that the supply curve and demand curve intersect at this point. The member banks are not going to borrow from the Fed. They are not going to borrow from the central bank or the Federal Reserve System. So then the BR is going to be zero, because here in this discussion we can say that the demand and supply is going to be RD is equal to 100 here, that we can see here. This much only will be demanded, and then accordingly RS is also going to be 100. So that means RD is equal to RS at this point here, right? So at this equilibrium point, you can say that this is the demand and supply of reserve. So in this case you can say that the BR, though supply curve is there, but actually the BR is zero here. So in this case what we can see that the supply curve, the actual supply curve what we are using is only vertical. So the horizontal part is not taking place here, because the discount rate is, the Fed fund rate is, actual Fed fund rate is lower than the discount rate here. So at IF, suppose the Fed fund rate rises above the discount rate, then we discussed this one already. Banks will borrow more and more at ID and relent at the Fed fund rate. Then at that time we can see that suppose this curve shifting rightwards, maybe we can do that. This curve is shifting rightwards, for example like this. Then you can say that the equilibrium is going to happen here. If this is the initial BR curve, then if they reduce it further, then they will be demanding here that this is the other equilibrium point. So here we can say that at this point when the IF, that the Fed fund rate keep on increasing, rises above the discount rate, for example this is the discount rate, and IFF increases, then you can see that they can borrow, the member banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve System and lend in the Fed fund market. So here you can see that the supply curve is horizontal, that is at this point, right? There is our infinite increase in the supply demand for reserve from the Federal Reserve System. So this is the diagram that we can use for the discuss the equilibrium in the market for reserve. So already it is clear to you, this is the downward sloping demand curve, but at this point that the interest rate on reserve, from this point onwards the demand curve will become perfectly elastic, and we already draw the vertical NBR reserve curve, the reserve constituted from NBR. This is non-responsive, inelastic to interest rate. Then this is the elastic part, that means determined by the discount rate. And the supply curve, given this one, the position of the demand curve, we can see that the interest rate, the equilibrium point is at this point. This is the equilibrium point. That means this is the equilibrium Fed fund rate in the market. So here you can see that it is the lower limit is the interest rate on reserve, and the upper limit is interest rate on discount, that is this one. And it's actually from this discussion based on how much open market operation they are doing and what is the position of the demand curve. Accordingly we can say, given this position, this is going to be the new equilibrium point. So let us look at what if we are going to say that this is never going to be the equilibrium point. The IFF1 is never going to be the equilibrium point, because when the given this position of demand curve and position of the supply curve, this is never going to be the Fed fund rate, because you can see that there is excess demand for reserve at this position. There is excess demand, right? Excess demand, because the opportunity cost of holding excess reserve decreases for many large banks, so they demand more reserve from the banks. Instead of, then they will be lending their money. What are the large banks? They prefer to lend their money for their loans and buying government securities, and instead to meet the required reserve and excess reserve, they will be preferring to borrow from the market. So there will be excess demand. So as a result, because of the excess demand, you know that when the demand increases, the rate of interest also increases here. So as a result, there is an upward pressure. More and more banks will prefer to borrow from the Fed fund market, and as a result the Fed fund rate is going to increase. What if we are also going to say that this is not going to be the equilibrium rate of interest, that the IFF2, because you can see that here there is excess supply is there. There is excess supply of reserve in the market. The demand is only this much at this rate, but supply is this much. So because of the excess supply, there will be pressure. There will be pressure to reduce the rate of interest in the market. So as a result, the rate of interest will decline to this point. So initially it will increase when Fed fund rate is this one, then there will be upward pressure because of excess demand. When the Fed fund rate is this one, IFF2, then there is a downward pressure on interest rate, and finally the equilibrium rate of interest will be attained at IFF. So in this session we have completed the discussion on how Fed fund rate are being determined using demand and supply curve, and there we also use the two policy tools by Federal Reserve System. One is interest rate on reserves, that is IR, and the other one is the discount rate, that is through the BR, the discount window, through the borrowed reserve window. And in the next session let's discuss what if by using all the three policy tools, that the reserve and excess, the reserve requirement, changing the reserve requirement and changing the that discount rate, and also doing open market operation, that the increase purchase or sale, and as a result what is going to happen to the Fed fund rate. Thank you, and see you in the next session.